The escort warship did not exist as a concept when the First World War began. The Royal Navy had destroyers for fleet work, cruisers for commerce protection, and nothing designed to hunt submarines in open ocean. By late 1914, German U-boats were sinking British merchant ships faster than the Admiralty could respond. The answer came from civilian industry. In January 1915, the Navy ordered its first purpose-built convoy escort ships from merchant shipyards. Small, coal-fired, built to whale catcher standards. The Acacia-class was the result. 24 vessels in service before the year was out. The modern escort ship was not designed. It was improvised, at speed, from a drawing of a boat that hunted whales. The Acacia-class was barely afloat before the first operational lessons began rewriting the design. U-boat commanders were adapting, convoy routes were lengthening, and the initial 12-pounder armament was already underpowered against surfaced submarines. The Azalea-class, 12 ships ordered in mid-1915, incorporated the first round of corrections: heavier guns, modified depth charge fittings, and a hull form refined for North Sea conditions. None of the changes were dramatic. Each was the product of a crew reporting back from a convoy that had survived, or had not. The Azalea-class was not a better design. It was the same design after it had been tested by the war it was built for. By late 1915, the convoy war had moved from coastal routes to the open Atlantic, and the escort sloops followed. The Arabis-class, 36 ships built across 19 yards, delivered through 1916, was the first generation design from the beginning to operate far from land. 4.7-inch guns replaced the older armament. Depth charges became standard rather than optional. The reinforced bow was carried forward as a permanent feature. What the Arabis-class established was not a set of specifications. It was a doctrine. Small ships, large numbers, carrying the convoy through regardless of weather or opposition. That doctrine would define the class for the next 30 years. In 1916, the Admiralty tried something the Arabis-class could not do: disappear. The Aubrietia and Anchusa subclasses were built not to look like warships. Merchant marine silhouettes, civilian superstructures, hidden guns behind hinged panels. The Q-ship was a floating deception. 28 Anchusa-class vessels entered service in 1917 and 1918, each designed to lure a U-boat commander into surfacing before revealing its armament. Results were mixed. The tactic worked when it worked, and cost ships and crews when it did not. The Anchusa-class was the escort program's most radical experiment, proof that the convoy war was not only fought with firepower, but with deception and the calculated acceptance of risk. Alongside the convoy escorts, the Royal Navy developed a parallel answer. Not a ship that protected convoys, but one that hunted submarines independently. The P-class, 45 vessels displacing around 600 tons, capable of 20 knots, armed with torpedoes as well as guns, was built between 1915 and 1917 specifically to chase surfaced U-boats before they could dive. Where the flower sloops measured success in convoys delivered safely, the P-class measured it in submarines forced under. By 1918, the Royal Navy was running both approaches simultaneously. Other navies were still watching and taking notes. The armistice arrived before the 22 ships of the 24 class were complete, and the Royal Navy accepted them anyway. Not because it expected another convoy war, but because the hulls were already paid for. Most went directly into reserve or colonial patrol duties. They were good ships for that purpose: seaworthy, economical, armed enough for anything likely to oppose them. What they were not was a strategic commitment to the lessons of the Atlantic campaign. The 24 class was the Royal Navy acknowledging that convoy escort had won the war, while quietly declining to make it the priority of the peace. 10 years after the armistice, the Royal Navy laid down 2 new sloops. 2. The Bridgewater-class was designed to do everything the wartime flowers could not: sweep mines, escort convoys, patrol colonial stations, and train reserve crews, all from the same hull on the same budget. The result was a ship that did each adequately, and none particularly well. Britain was not alone in this mistake. The United States had decommissioned its entire coastal patrol force. France was building colonial avisos. Other navies watched what Britain did because Britain had written the doctrine. And what Britain was telling them was that the escort ship was no longer a priority. The Hastings-class was the Bridgewater design with a longer hull and a 5th ship for the Royal Indian Navy, an acknowledgement that the Empire required presence from Hong Kong to Aden and that the sloop was the most economical way to provide it. 4 ships deployed to stations where the most likely threat was a smuggler rather than a submarine wolf pack. They were competent colonial patrol ships. As convoy escorts, they were too slow, too lightly armed, and too few. The Hastings-class is remembered as evidence of how completely the interwar Navy had redefined the escort ship, from instrument of survival in industrial warfare to diplomatic presence in distant waters. The Shoreham-class added 8 hulls to the sloop inventory and deepened the confusion about what a peacetime escort was supposed to be. All 8 served in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean, stations where colonial policing mattered and Atlantic convoy defense did not. When war came, several found themselves in the western approaches doing the job the class had never been designed for. HMS Rochester helped kill 2 U-boats in the Atlantic. The class was not built to do any of that. It succeeded anyway, because ships and crews adapt to what war requires, regardless of what peacetime doctrine intended. The Grimsby-class was the first British interwar sloop designed with the convoy war in mind. 8 ships for the Royal Navy, 4 for the Royal Australian Navy, and for the first time since 1918, the primary criterion was anti-submarine escort rather than colonial patrol. 2 4.7-inch guns, ASDIC fitted from the beginning, range sufficient for Atlantic operations. The Grimsby-class was not a dramatic leap forward. It was the Navy acknowledging, 18 years after the armistice, that the escort ship's real job had never actually changed. Several were lost to the submarines they were finally designed to counter. The lesson had been remembered. It had arrived 6 years before the war that would test it. While Britain was building sloops for colonial patrol, the Soviet Navy was building coastal escort ships for shallow, contested waters close to friendly ports. The Uragan-class, 18 vessels laid down from 1927, was the first purpose-built escort fleet of the Soviet Navy. Fast by Soviet standards, armed with guns, torpedoes, and basic anti-submarine equipment. They were built in civilian yards by a navy that had no pre-revolutionary escort tradition, working from doctrine partly borrowed from the Royal Navy and partly invented from scratch. The Uragan-class established that the Soviet Union would approach the escort mission on its own terms and in its own quantities. Britain entered the war with fewer than 20 modern escort vessels for the North Atlantic. Germany had more than 50 U-boats. The solution was a whale catcher design from Smith's Dock of Middlesbrough, armed, ordered by the 100 from yards that had never built a warship. The Flower-class Corvette was slow, barely faster than the convoys it protected. It rolled in Atlantic weather, was cramped, wet, and exhausting to serve aboard. 225 were built by Britain, Canada, and 11 allied nations. If you want to explore this further, links to recommended books and scale models are in the description below. The Flower-class did not win the Battle of the Atlantic. It made losing it impossible. The original Flower-class had been designed for coastal escort in the North Sea. The Atlantic required something different: a longer forecastle to keep the bow from burying in heavy swells, more range, better habitability for crews spending weeks at sea. The modified Flower-class, 69 ships with a raised forecastle and extended hull, was the Admiralty's acknowledgement that the first design had been good enough to save the convoys and not quite good enough for the men serving in them. The modifications came through hard experience. Every change was the record of a problem the original class had encountered and survived, or had not. By 1943, the Flower-class had proven itself and identified its limits. The Castle-class was the answer. Larger, faster, carrying the squid ahead-throwing mortar with sensors reflecting 3 years of Atlantic experience. 44 ships were built, better submarine hunters than anything Britain had put to sea in the convoy escort role. They arrived too late for the worst of the campaign. The U-boat threat had already peaked by the time most castles were operational. The class represents the gap between what the convoy war demanded at its most desperate and what British industry could deliver once it had understood the problem. A gap of approximately 3 years. By 1942, it was clear the Corvette was not the end of the escort ship's evolution. It was the beginning. The River-class frigate was larger, faster, built by naval yards rather than merchant shipbuilders, better sensors, a second shaft for redundancy, and range for the full Atlantic. 151 ships were built across Britain, Canada, and Australia. The River-class was technically a frigate, not a corvette. The distinction was deliberate. The Navy had learned what it needed from the Flower-class and was building towards something more capable. The escort ship was no longer an improvisation. It was becoming a profession. The Loch-class was the escort ship the Royal Navy had been working towards since 1939. The squid mortar as primary weapon, the most advanced sensors available, speed sufficient to run down a surfaced U-boat. 28 ships were completed before the war ended. Several more were cancelled as the U-boat threat collapsed. The Loch-class stands at the end of the wartime escort program as an endpoint, the design that answered every question the convoy war had asked. It also demonstrates industrial lag. The best escort Britain built entered service when it was least needed, produced in smallest numbers precisely because the crisis it was designed for had already been resolved. Australia built 60 corvettes during the Second World War and called them minesweepers. The Bathurst-class was smaller and slower than the Flower, designed for Pacific and Indian Ocean shallow waters, officially designated as minesweeping sloops by the Royal Navy. In practice, they did everything: convoy escort, anti-submarine patrol, shore bombardment, troop transport, mine clearance. 2 were sunk by Japanese forces. Several participated in the liberation of Borneo. The classification was a technicality. The Bathurst-class was what the escort ship always was in wartime. Whatever was needed, done by whoever was there to do it. Italy entered the war with almost no purpose-built escort vessels, and discovered within 2 years that its entire Mediterranean strategy depended on them. The Gabbiano-class was the response. 29 corvettes built in 1942 and 1943, designed specifically for the Mediterranean. Shorter convoy routes, shallower waters, and a constant air threat that the Atlantic escorts rarely faced. Their anti-aircraft armament was heavier than contemporary British corvettes. After Italy's armistice in 1943, surviving Gabbianos continued in service through the post-war Marina Militare, the last not retired until 1972. The enemy built the same ship for the same reason. It lasted 30 years. Japan understood the submarine threat late and responded with industrial intensity. The Kaibōkan program began in 1940 and accelerated through 1943 as American submarines destroyed the supply lines Japan's war economy depended on. The Etorofu-class was the first production Kaibōkan. 14 ships with effective ASW sensors designed for Pacific convoy routes. 3 further classes followed: each incorporating lessons at the cost of ships and crews. More than 170 Kaibōkan were built in total. By the time Japanese industry had mastered the escort ship, American submarines had already made its mission unwinnable. Japan learned the same lesson as Britain in 1917, at the same cost a generation later. The United States built 103 patrol craft escort vessels and deployed them wherever the Atlantic-sized destroyer escort was too large and the coastal patrol boat too small. Equipped with sonar, hedgehog, and depth charges, the same weapons the Flower-class had pioneered, PCE crews were reservists with weeks of training. By 1944, escort ships were being produced on the same industrial schedule as the Liberty ships they were assigned to protect. The class demonstrated something the pre-war Navy had not fully planned for: that basic training and mass production could generate effective anti-submarine capability faster than any peacetime budget had anticipated. The Admirable-class occupied the same doctrinal space as the Bathurst in Australia. Officially, minesweepers, operationally, corvettes, deployed wherever the theatre demanded. 184 ships were commissioned. In the Pacific, they cleared approaches before amphibious landings, hunted submarines in shallow island chain waters, and escorted coastal convoys along routes too confined for destroyer escorts. The Admirable-class was the American escort minesweeper, working the same way the Bathurst worked in the Coral Sea and the Flower worked in the Atlantic. Classified according to its design, employed according to its circumstances. Every navy that stopped building escort ships eventually needed them again. Germany solved the escort problem with the same instinct Britain had used in 1915. Convert the fishing fleet. The Four-Posten-Boot program requisitioned hundreds of deep-sea trawlers and converted them into patrol and escort vessels, armed with guns, fitted with depth charges, assigned to coastal convoy routes in the North Sea, the Baltic, and along the Norwegian coast. They were not purpose-built warships, but they were available, numerous, and capable of doing the work that purpose-built escorts would have done. The Four-Posten-Boot program is the mirror image of the Royal Navy's trawler fleet. The same improvisation, from the same resource, in service of the opposing side. When France fell in June 1940, the Free French naval forces faced a problem without precedent. How to maintain a fighting navy when your shipyards, ports, and most personnel were occupied or interned? The answer was to sail what could be sailed, and crew it with whoever could reach London or North Africa. Free French corvettes were overwhelmingly Flower-class ships transferred from Allied navies. What distinguished the FNFL escort program was not the ships, but the institutional act. Maintaining a naval force, and with it, a claim to national sovereignty from borrowed hulls in foreign harbours. The escort ship was, for Free France, not a weapon, but an argument. The war ended. The submarine did not. In 1948, the Soviet Navy began commissioning Project 122 BIS subchasers. 60 vessels NATO designated the Kronshtadt-class, not to be confused with the unbuilt battlecruiser of the same name. They were direct descendants of wartime doctrine, small, numerous, coastal, designed for Baltic and Black Sea approaches. Weapons were depth charges, sensors were hull-mounted sonar, speed was adequate for diesel submarines that had to surface to recharge. The Kronshtadt-class was the last expression of the World War II escort formula in Soviet service. Useful, proven, and already obsolete before the American nuclear submarine demonstrated what the next threat would require. Where the Kronstadt had reproduced the World War II template, the SO-1 class was built to something the Soviet Navy was still working out. 157 vessels commissioned from 1957, diesel-powered, faster than their predecessors, equipped with RBU-1200 anti-submarine rocket launchers that could attack a submarine without requiring the escort to pass directly over it. The SO-1 represented the Soviet Navy's first systematic attempt to update the escort for the nuclear era. Not yet successful, still coastal in ambition, but no longer simply reproducing a wartime design. It was the transitional class, aware that the threat had changed, not yet certain what changing the ship actually meant. The Poti-class asked a question no escort ship had faced before. What if speed was the answer? Project 204, 66 ships commissioned between 1961 and 1968, used the M2 gas turbine, the first Soviet warship powered by gas propulsion, achieving 38 to 39 knots on trials. The logic was direct. Nuclear submarines were fast, so the escort pursuing them had to be faster. The Poti was the Soviet Navy's most radical expression of that premise, producing the fastest coastal ASW Corvette ever built. Whether speed alone could close the gap with nuclear submarine performance was a different question. The Poti answered the question it had been given. The question itself was still being debated. The Albatross-class was built on American money. 4 Italian corvettes and 4 additional hulls for Allied navies, all funded through the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, equipped with American sensors and weapons designed to meet a NATO anti-submarine standard that had never previously existed. For the first time, a common corvette specification was shared across Allied navies. Sensor fits were coordinated, and the escort became a component of collective defense rather than a national solution. It proved that small navies could operate capable ASW corvettes if the cost was shared. The alliance had invented the post-war escort ship, on an Italian hull with American instruments. Denmark built 4 corvettes in the mid-1950s and classified them as frigates, because in the Danish Navy, the word corvette carried no official meaning. The Bellona-class was what a small Baltic state could afford: compact, maintainable, available in sufficient numbers to cover the required sea area. Displacement under 800 tons. Endurance calculated for the Baltic, not the Atlantic. The Bellona-class was not a distinguished design. It was an honest one. A small country answering the NATO ASW requirement with what its budget and geography actually permitted, rather than what the alliance's planners theoretically required. Italy had built the Albatross-class with American guidance and American money. The De Cristofaro-class it built entirely on its own. 4 ships commissioned in 1965 and 1966, armed with the OTO Melara 76mm gun and the Menon ASW mortar, fitted with variable depth sonar that could track submarines below thermocline layers where hull-mounted sensors lost contact. The De Cristofaro-class demonstrated that Italy had absorbed 15 years of NATO ASW doctrine and could now design and build to it without assistance. It arrived at the moment when the escort was about to become a missile platform, technically accomplished and 1 generation from obsolescence. Finland built 2 corvettes and refused to call them corvettes. The Turunmaa and Karjala were classified as gunboats, constrained by a peace treaty that capped Finnish naval tonnage until détente loosened its grip. What emerged was extraordinary. A Rolls-Royce Olympus gas turbine pushing 700 tons to 40 knots, Swedish fire control, Norwegian sensors, built from Western technology Finland could purchase and Soviet tolerance it had to negotiate. The escort ship had traveled 50 years from the Acacia-class to a platform no single nation could fully build alone. Every navy that stopped building escort ships eventually needed them again. The sea lanes that the whale catcher had defended in 1915 still needed defending. They always did.